A millionaire marries his newly hired unattractive maid on a bet, but what he discovers on their wedding night leaves him shocked. This is a story about broken things made beautiful again, about love born from ruin, and a woman whose quiet strength brought a powerful man to his knees. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Now sit back and get ready for a tale of betrayal, redemption, and the kind of love that can't be bought. You can have the whole company, Damien Cross said, swirling his scotch like he owned the world because he did, or at least believed he should, but only if you marry a woman with nothing, within 7 days, and make her love you. Julian Cross didn't blink. They stood alone on the rooftop terrace of Cross and Wolf Holdings, the city glowing behind them like a field of dying stars. It was after midnight. The gala downstairs still pulsed with artificial laughter and clinking glasses, but up here the air was cold and sharp like the blade buried in Damien's words. Julian set down his glass. "You're drunk." Damien chuckled. "No, I'm bored, and tired of your holier-than-thou attitude about legacy and merit. You think you're owed a seat at the table because you work hard, because you don't flaunt. Please?" Julian's jaw tightened. Damien stepped closer, his voice silk-wrapped poison. "Let's make it interesting. I'll back out of the succession claim. Give you my voting shares. All of it. But you have to prove you understand real control, real perception, public influence." Julian narrowed his eyes. "What's your game?" Damien grinned. "Marry someone beneath you. Someone so far below your world that the headlines will burn. I want to see you charm her, wed her, parade her through the press, and make her stay. A full year. Then and only then I'll step aside." Julian's silence stretched. Damien pressed on. "She has to be poor, unpolished, unimpressive to our board. I'll even pick the category blue collar. No secret heiresses, no Ivy League volunteers on sabbatical. A nobody." Julian's heart thudded once, then again. This was a trap. It reeked of power plays and sabotage, but that's what Damien was best at. And somewhere deep in Julian's chest, beneath years of self-restraint and practiced neutrality, a spark flickered. Not rage, not even pride, just a challenge, a chance to beat his brother at his own game. "And if I refuse?" Julian asked, voice even. Voice. Damien shrugged. "Then I assume you concede. I'll take your seat on the board. The Cross name becomes mine alone to shape. But if you say yes," he leaned in, smile feral, "you've got 7 days to find her. Marry her. And the countdown begins." Julian looked out over the skyline, his empire, his blood, everything he'd been building since their father's death. Damien had always been the showman. Julian had been the strategist, the fixer, the one who got things done in the shadows. He turned back to his brother, his tone cool as winter glass. "Fine. You've got a deal." Downstairs, amid gold gowns and empty toasts, the party roared on. But on the rooftop, a quiet war had begun. And somewhere across the city, in a forgotten antique shop dusted with time and silence, a woman named Clara Voss sketched blueprints in the margins of a gas bill, unaware that her life was about to become someone's cruel bet. A bet that would begin with deception and end with everything. "You can have the whole company," Damien Cross said, swirling his scotch like it was a crown, "but only if you marry a woman with nothing, within 7 days, and make her love you." Julian Cross didn't blink. They stood on the frost-kissed rooftop terrace of the Cross and Wolf Tower, 40 floors above Manhattan. Below them, headlights streamed like restless veins. Inside, the charity gala raged on music chatter, the exhausting rituals of status. But up here, it was just the two brothers, the weight of legacy between them. Damien was dressed like always, 3-piece charcoal suit, no tie. Half a smile. He played the prodigal heir so well, you'd forget he'd nearly burned the company down 5 years ago with his reckless mergers. But public forgiveness had come cheap, especially when your last name was Cross. Julian's suit was simpler. Black, pressed, quietly tailored. No pin, no watch. He didn't need a Rolex to tell him when a knife was twisting. "I assume this is your idea of a business proposal," Julian said, voice flat. Damien raised his glass in mock salute. "No, dear brother. This is your one chance to prove you're not just the company ghost. You think integrity makes you worthy. I think power does. So let's test it. Julian looked out at the skyline. So many buildings bore the cross-name hospitals, banks, foundations. His father had built an empire not on flash but on grit. But grit didn't impress boardrooms anymore. Drama did. Disruption. Showmanship. And Damien was a master of spectacle. What's the catch? Julian asked. No catch. Just conditions. Damien's grin spread like oil. She must be poor. Unremarkable. Someone the press would laugh at. No secret trust funds. No hidden pedigrees. I want the world to see you kneel to a nobody. Julian considered walking away. He could, but Damien would never let him forget it. And something about the challenge, it wasn't just about ego. It was about truth, about whether love perception and power could be manipulated like numbers on a screen. You have until Sunday to find her, Damien continued. The wedding must be real, legal. Photos, witnesses, the whole fairy tale. And then you stay married for a year. If she leaves you before then or finds out it's a game, he sipped, you lose. Julian's hands remained steady, but his jaw flexed once. And if I win, he asked. Damien smirked. Then I'll hand over my shares. Step back. You become majority heir. The throne is yours. Julian didn't answer right away. He thought of the board of his father's legacy hanging by threads of everything he'd done behind the scenes to hold it all together. And then he thought of the look on Damien's face when Julian beat him at his own twisted game. Deal, Julian said coldly. Draw it up. Damien laughed, tossing back the last of his drink. I already have. Across the city, in a neighborhood untouched by marble and glass, Clara Voss crouched over a cracked end table in a backroom workshop. The room smelled of aged wood paint thinner and jasmine tea. She pressed her pencil against the edge of a blueprint, then hesitated. In her worn canvas bag beside her, a folded piece of paper peeked out crayon scribbles in bright red and blue, a smiling stick figure and shaky words. One day Mom will be happy again. She didn't see it fall deeper into the shadows as she returned to her workbench. She didn't see the clock strike midnight, and she didn't know that she had just become someone's wager. Julian Cross didn't find her in a boardroom. He found her beneath layers of dust and sunlight, crouched behind a mahogany cabinet with a chisel in one hand and a magnifying glass in the other. The antique shop was nearly invisible from the street, wedged between a shuttered bakery and a pawn shop, its window fogged with time. No name on the door, just a hanging bell and the faint scent of linseed oil and citrus wax. He wouldn't have come in if he hadn't seen the listing online, restoration consultation by appointment. Cash only. The ad was buried beneath 100 junk listings, probably on purpose. He stepped inside. The bell jingled faint and fractured. No one at the counter. He wandered, brushing past arched mirrors, cracked porcelain vases, tarnished candelabras. It wasn't just an antique shop. It was a graveyard of forgotten things. And then he saw her, bent over the leg of a broken Victorian chair, auburn hair tied loosely with twine sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hands moved with delicate precision, sanding away years of grime to reveal the carving beneath two interlocking roses, worn but intact. She didn't look up when she spoke. We're closed, appointments only. Her voice surprised him. It was low melodic, but flat, tired. I'm not here for furniture, Julian said, stepping closer. She sighed, finally lifting her head. Their eyes met. She was not beautiful, not in the way magazines printed or socialites performed, but her face had lines that spoke of long days and quiet grief. Her cheekbone bore a faint scar, her lips naturally downturned like she'd forgotten how to smile properly, yet her gaze was steady, unflinching, like someone who had learned how to survive by watching everything. I don't do walk-ins, she said. He nodded. Then, consider this an appointment. She straightened slowly, dusting her hands on a linen apron. What do you want restored? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded paper on the nearest table. A photo of an old chapel bench, water-damaged and warped. Her eyes scanned it for 3 seconds. Rot set in. Probably needs replacement, not repair. "I want restoration," he said. She looked up again, her brow furrowed, but something behind her eyes stirred. Curiosity. Challenge. How soon, she asked. "Immediately. I'm willing to pay triple." She stared at him like she could smell a lie. No one pays triple for sentiment. He exhaled. Time to pivot. "There's more," he said. "I'm in a situation that's complicated. I need to get married. This week. It would be in name only. I'd compensate you handsomely. And you'd have control terms, boundaries, whatever you want." Her silence thickened the air. He expected disbelief or mockery. Instead, she just blinked slowly. "Why me?" He didn't flinch. "Because you have nothing to gain. And that's exactly what I need." She gave a hollow laugh, bitter and brief. "You're honest. I'll give you that." But her hand wandered unconsciously to her canvas bag on the floor. Tucked inside medicine receipts, expiring lease papers, and somewhere in the folded creases, a child's drawing she hadn't dared look at in days. She looked at him again. "You're serious, I am. And the money would be wired today before I walk out." A pause. Then her voice quiet, resolved. "I have conditions. I expect them. No touching. No appearances without notice. And this ends after 1 year. No renewal. No fine print." He extended his hand. Agreed. She didn't shake it, just nodded once slowly. "Then I suppose I'll marry you." Julian nodded in return. "I'll send my attorney. The paperwork will be clean." As he turned to leave, she returned to her workbench without a word. The roses on the chair leg were coming back to life. Julian didn't know why, but something about that felt disarming. She didn't ask his name. He didn't ask hers. But her name was Clara Voss, and in 3 days she would become Mrs. Clara Cross. Clara didn't move for a full minute after he left. The bell above the door gave a hollow jingle as it closed, but the sound lingered like the taste of something burned. She stood by the bench, the chisel still in her hand, but now her fingers had gone slack. She'd heard of men like him. Polished, precise, dangerous not because of what they said, but because of what they didn't. The way he had studied her, not with desire, but with calculation. Like she was a solution, not a person. She had been someone's solution once before, and it had nearly ruined her. Upstairs in the apartment above the shop, the heat sputtered from the old vents, coughing like a smoker in winter. Clara climbed the steps, her bones aching. Every creak of the wood was familiar. The narrow hallway, the stained wallpaper, the second door on the left. She opened it gently. The little girl was curled on a mattress by the window, her small form tucked into a patchwork blanket. Her brown curls splayed like wild vines across the pillow thumb tucked beneath her chin. Clara crouched and smoothed the blanket. Tucked into the corner of the bed frame, barely visible beneath a plush elephant, was the drawing, the one he had seen fall weeks ago. Crayon scribbled in shaky red and blue stick figures holding hands, a tiny house with crooked windows, and at the bottom the words, "One day, Mom will be happy again." Clara felt her chest tighten. She picked it up and stared. The offer was insane. Marry a stranger. But she knew what he was really saying. Take the money. Buy safety. Not for herself, but for Eden. For the overdue rent. For the antibiotics the doctor kept warning about. For the private speech therapy she'd only dared to dream of. It wouldn't be a real marriage. He'd said that. And yet, she had spent the last 5 years carving herself into someone people wouldn't notice. Neutral clothes, no makeup, head down, hands busy, never asking for more than silence and space. Now someone had noticed, and instead of offering love or pity or cruelty, he'd offered a transaction. Somehow that was worse, but also more honest. The next morning, Julian's lawyer arrived precisely at 9:00 a.m. He was as slick as his client Young, pressed emotionless. He handed over a thick envelope and didn't stay for tea. Inside were contracts. Clean, straightforward. Clauses that protected her. Outlines of the transfer. No NDA, no prenup required. just a 1-year agreement and a tidy sum that made her throat go dry. She stared at the signature line for a long time, then signed. Julian watched the wire transfer notification flash across his phone as he walked out of his Midtown office. Confirmed. The first move had been made. He leaned against the elevator wall and loosened his tie. He'd expected to feel smug. Instead, he felt uneasy. There was something about her silence. Not the silence of obedience, but the kind that chose not to speak because it didn't need to. As if she knew exactly who he was and had agreed anyway. In 3 days, they would stand side by side in front of a justice of the peace. She would wear borrowed shoes and a thrifted dress. He would wear a custom suit, and neither of them would smile. But in the back of her canvas bag, folded between a lease renewal and a bottle of cough syrup, one drawing would remain. One day, Mom will be happy again. Clara had always imagined as a girl that if she ever got married, there would be wildflowers. Nothing extravagant, just something gentle, something real. Instead, there were cameras, flashes, smirks, perfumed air and lacquered nails, a polished courthouse hall dressed up to look like a private occasion, though nothing about it felt private, or sacred, or hers. She stood in a simple dove-gray dress that grazed her knees and clung too tightly to her ribs. She hadn't worn a dress in 3 years. Eden had picked it out from the second-hand shop window and beamed, "You'll look like a movie star." "Mama!" She didn't. She looked like someone pretending to belong at a wedding that wasn't hers. Across from her, Julian stood in a navy bespoke suit, a silver watch gleaming beneath his cuff. Immaculate, effortless. His expression was carved in marble. They hadn't spoken since the contract was signed. Now they stood before a judge in a pale blue robe who looked more confused than celebratory. Julian's lawyer handed over the paperwork. The judge asked them to repeat after him. Clara's voice barely carried when she said, "I do." Julian didn't falter. His was steady, crisp, as if it were a boardroom pledge, not a vow. There were no rings, no kiss. Just the scratch of a pen and the click of a camera lens. A photo to be filed with the press per Damien's request. When it was done, the judge looked between them as if trying to decipher something unsaid. "Congratulations," he offered, unsure. Clara merely nodded. Julian turned to lead her out. The reception, if it could be called that, was held at a restaurant he hadn't asked her about. Crystal chandeliers, velvet walls, every fork polished twice, the kind of place where rich people gathered to avoid saying anything too real. They sat at a long, narrow table, just the two of them and a few business acquaintances. Damien was conspicuously absent, pulling strings behind the scenes, no doubt. Julian's assistant gave a stiff toast. Something about unity and the future. Clara didn't listen. She couldn't. All she could hear was the clicking of heels across marble, the polite venom of the women whispering behind linen napkins. "She looks like a ghost." No makeup. Is this a publicity stunt or a tax write-off? Clara excused herself before dessert. In the bathroom, she locked the stall and pulled out her canvas bag. Her hands trembled. She wasn't sure why. The hardest part was supposed to be over. She reached for her lip balm, and that's when the drawing slipped free. It fluttered to the tile like a leaf. She stared at it. Eden's handwriting. That bright, impossible sun in the corner. One day, Mom will be happy again. She crouched, picked it up carefully, pressed it to her chest. No one here knew about Eden. No one knew about the sleepless nights, or the car that wouldn't start, or the day Clara sold her engagement ring to buy antibiotics. They didn't know because Clara had stopped telling her story years ago. What was the point of a voice no one wanted to hear? Back at the table, Julian sat with a half-empty glass of wine. He hadn't touched the food. He looked toward the hallway just as she returned, face-calm, hair pulled back tighter, a storm disguised as silence. She slid into the chair beside him, didn't touch her fork. He glanced down and saw something poking from the edge of her bag, a piece of paper folded and worn peeking out between her wallet and a wrapped granola bar. His brow creased. He tilted his head, just enough to glimpse the edge of a child's scrawl. Red crayon, a drawing of 2 stick figures. He didn't say anything, but something he couldn't name, tugged in his chest. Neither of them said a word on the drive home. Not when the car pulled through the gates of the mansion. Not when the valet opened the door. Not when she stepped into the grand foyer like a stranger in a museum. A staff member showed her to the guest wing. Julian watched her disappear down the corridor, back rigid, hands still. For a moment he stood alone in the silence. Then he whispered to no one in particular. "What did I just do?" The mansion was too quiet. Not in the peaceful way, but in the kind that echoed your own thoughts back at you, cold, clinical, untouchable. Clara followed the silent housekeeper down the east wing, the soles of her flats brushing the imported rugs like she didn't belong on them. The corridor curved slowly each step, carrying her deeper into a house she was supposedly part of now, but that had all the warmth of a gallery after closing hours. The room they assigned her was large, sterile, perfect. White walls, cream bedding, a chandelier that glinted like it had never heard a child's laughter. On the vanity sat a jewelry box, empty, and a printed note from the assistant. "Your wardrobe allowance has been transferred to this account. It included a debit card, a zero welcome gift." Clara didn't touch it. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and unzipped her bag. She pulled out Eden's drawing, now creased at the corners from her tight grip in the bathroom, and set it on the nightstand. The red crayon sun glowed beneath the lamplight, wild and happy in a way she hadn't felt in years. She ran her fingers along the words. "One day, Mom will be happy again." It was easier to believe when her daughter said it. Meanwhile, down the hall in his own wing, Julian sat in his office, untouched, whiskey in hand. The lights were low. Rain tapped at the windows in thin streaks, and the fireplace crackled behind him, but nothing could warm the chill sinking into his spine. He couldn't stop thinking about that drawing. He hadn't meant to see it. It had caught his eye by accident, and yet it lingered. Not the scribbles, but the unspoken weight inside them. The aching kind of hope that came from someone who had no reason to still believe. A child. Clara had a child. She hadn't mentioned it. And part of him wanted to be angry at that. Shouldn't that have been disclosed? They were married after all, even if it was transactional. But something stopped him short. Maybe it wasn't her silence that stung. Maybe it was how natural her silence felt. She didn't tell him, because she hadn't expected him to care. And that realization curled uncomfortably in his chest. Later that night, Julian passed her door on the way to the study. He paused. There was no light under the frame, no sound, no footsteps, just the stillness of someone who had learned to disappear into space. He almost knocked. Almost. Instead, he moved on. But inside, Clara sat cross-legged on the carpet, the wedding dress carefully folded on the bed, and her fingers clutching the fraying edge of the child's drawing like it was a lifeline. She whispered softly into the dark, her voice barely there, "Sweet dreams, Eden. Mama's okay." And then silence, the kind of silence no wedding ring could fix. The Cross estate sat on 4 acres of manicured perfection, but within its walls, Clara felt like a trespasser in her own name. The wedding had come and gone, leaving in its wake a strange purgatory, one where she wore the title of Mrs. Julian Cross, but spoke fewer words to him than she did to the housekeeper each morning. Julian rose early, left for the office before breakfast, returned late, and never asked how her day had gone. Clara didn't mind. At least that's what she told herself. The rooms she'd been given were beautiful but hollow. Every drawer empty, every surface polished. She filled none of them. The only things she unpacked were her toolbox, her sketchbook, and one chipped ceramic music box she had restored years ago and couldn't bring herself to part with. It played a lullaby Eden used to fall asleep to. She found a rhythm quickly. Up at 6, tea in the sunroom, a walk through the greenhouse if no one was in it. Sketches after lunch, work in the old stables after dusk, where she'd discovered a dusty collection of antique chairs and iron sconces no one had touched in years. The restoration gave her hands purpose, her silence sanctuary. She didn't ask permission, and Julian didn't object. On the 4th day, she passed him on the grand staircase. He was descending with a briefcase in one hand, jacket over his shoulder. Their eyes met for a second too long. He gave a stiff nod. "Good morning." She returned it with a polite Mr. Cross before continuing past him. He paused at the bottom step, watching her retreat. "Clara," he said abruptly, as if the name had startled him on the way out. She turned. His voice gentled, but only slightly. "You don't have to keep calling me that. Julian is fine." She hesitated, then gave a single nod. "Okay." And just like that, they resumed orbiting each other close in proximity, miles apart in meaning. Julian began noticing things. Not through conversation, Clara rarely spoke more than she had to, but through the quiet marks of her presence. The corner of the foyer that had always felt too stark now held a small arrangement of dried wildflowers in a clay vase. A cracked one he realized she must have repaired. The reading room he never used now had rearranged seating chairs angled toward the afternoon light, a folded blanket over the armrest. He didn't know why, but it made the room feel lived in. And once during a late-night walk through the east corridor, he passed the former ballroom and found her inside. The chandeliers were dim, the drapes open. She was on her knees, hands stained with varnish, restoring the legs of a century-old armoire. She didn't notice him at first. But when she finally glanced up, sleeves, rolled hair, pinned back with a pencil behind her ear, she didn't flinch or apologize. She just returned to work, like the house was hers to fix. The next morning, the head of housekeeping approached Julian in the kitchen. "Sir, Mrs. Cross has requested we stop cleaning the west wing." He looked up from his tablet. "Why?" She said she'd prefer to maintain it herself. He hesitated. Let her. Days blurred into weeks. Clara never asked for anything. But once, when he returned home from a week-long trip, he found something on the wall outside his study. A framed sketch. Pencil. Impossibly detailed. His mother's favorite garden bench, long since removed from the estate. He stared at it for minutes. There was no note, no signature, just the art, and the realization that somehow this woman, this stranger he'd married, had been paying more attention than anyone in his life in the past 10 years. That night, Julian stood outside her door again, hands in his pockets. He didn't knock, but he wanted to. Not to demand or invade, just to ask, "What else have I missed?" One night, Clara found herself lingering by the kitchen window longer than usual. Rain tapped against the glass like a secret wanting to be let in. She held a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, half warm, untouched. The clock read 10:42 p.m. Julian still wasn't home. She didn't ask where he went. She never did. But the longer she stayed in this house, the more she realized how profoundly empty his life was, despite the staff, the estate, the tailored suits, and curated calendar. It wasn't loneliness that clung to the walls. It was isolation by design. Across the hall from her room, the study door remained slightly ajar. Curiosity edged in. Clara stepped toward it, not fully intending to go in. But the lamplight pooled onto the hallway floor, and something pulled her. Inside, the shelves stretched to the ceiling. Floor-to-glass windows framed the dark sky. On the desk lay open books, blueprints, and she blinked a few of her own sketches. The corner of her mouth lifted just barely. He had kept them. A few minutes later, she placed one of the framed drawings, his mother's garden bench, on the desk instead of the wall. Let him decide where it belonged. Just as she turned to leave, she noticed something else. A music box. Old, tarnished, and very similar to the one Eden adored. But this one wasn't hers. It was cracked along the top, missing a winding key. She touched it gently, then took a step back. That night, she didn't sleep. She sketched long into the early hours, her fingers moving as though trying to remember a language she hadn't spoken in years. Julian returned just after midnight, soaked from the rain and unusually tired. The business dinner had been dull, the donors unimpressed with his refusal to entertain gossip. He pulled off his tie as he stepped into the study and paused. The framed sketch was sitting on his desk. Next to it, the music box, restored. It was faint, but the ballerina twirled again. A gentle, haunting melody filled the air. He didn't know how she had found the key, or the time. But he stood still and listened to the entire tune hand's motionless heart, unsure of what it was feeling. She'd gone through his private space, but it didn't feel like a trespass. It felt like an answer. The following afternoon, they crossed paths in the greenhouse. She was inspecting a cracked ceramic pot, hands smudged with soil. He hesitated. You fixed the music box. Clara looked up, brushing hair from her cheek. It was missing a cog, not a key. I fabricated one. A pause. You went into my study, he said. She nodded. I was curious. I don't apologize for that. Julian didn't expect her to. In fact, he found he liked that she didn't. That box belonged to my mother, he said quietly. I guessed. He stepped closer, something softer in his eyes. You're not what I expected. She didn't flinch. Neither are you. They stood among the rosemary and violets, the silence between them no longer cold but questioning, tentative, almost warm. The storm rolled in around dusk. Thick gray clouds swallowed the last of the sun, and the wind curled through the cross estate like something searching for a way in. Rain began softly like whispers against the windows, but grew louder, more insistent, until it roared across the roof in waves. Clara didn't mind storms. She'd grown up with a mother who used to say thunder reminded the sky not to hold too much in. She found comfort in the noise and the way storms washed everything clean. But that night it wasn't the thunder that pulled her from her room. It was the sound of someone crying. The sobs were faint, muffled behind the thick door of the west guest room, a room she knew was rarely used. She hesitated, hand resting on the knob. Then knocked gently. A small voice inside stammered, "Come in." She opened the door to find a girl, maybe 10 or 11, sitting on the floor in pajamas, knees tucked to her chest, eyes red. The storm must have woken her. Clara stepped inside slowly. "You're okay." The girl blinked at her. "You're Mrs. Cross." Clara gave a soft smile. "Clara, please." The girl hiccuped. "My name's Annabelle. I'm Julian's niece. My dad's on some retreat and Julian said I could stay here while he was gone. I don't like the thunder." Clara sat beside her, lowering herself gently onto the rug. "Me neither. But I've found ways to trick myself." Annabelle looked at her wide-eyed, like what Clara reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a tiny folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, a miniature version of one of Eden's drawings. "Every time I hear thunder, I draw something beautiful in my mind. Then I try to draw it for real later." Annabelle's gaze followed the paper as if it were magic, like what Clara smiled. Rainbows, houses made of cake, birds with shoes, anything that feels better than fear. The girl laughed a soft, shaky giggle that broke through the storm. Then, without thinking, she leaned against Clara's shoulder. Julian found them there 20 minutes later. He had come to check on Annabelle after hearing a loud crash of thunder, but stopped in the doorway when he saw them. Clara's arm was gently around his niece. They were both watching the storm through the window, wrapped in a blanket. Between them was a notebook open to a half-finished drawing, a girl and a woman flying a kite shaped like the moon. Annabelle didn't see him, but Clara did. Their eyes met. Julian didn't speak. He only nodded once and stepped away, closing the door quietly behind him. He didn't go far. He stood in the hallway for a long time, back against the wall, rain streaking the windows behind him. He wasn't used to the warmth that had flickered in his chest. He wasn't used to someone giving something without wanting anything in return. Later that night, he passed Clara in the hall. "Thank you," he said, nodding toward the guest room. "She's a good kid," Clara replied, brushing hair behind her ear. Julian hesitated. "You're good with her." "I've had practice," she said. And for the first time, she didn't guard the softness in her voice. "You have a child," he said quietly, not accusing, just curious. Clara looked at him. Her expression didn't change, but her posture did less wary now. "I do," she said. "Her name's Eden. She's 7. A long pause. "She doesn't live here." Clara shook her head. "Not yet." Julian didn't press, didn't ask why, just nodded. But as she turned to go, he asked more gently this time, "Why do you do all this?" "All what? Fix things. People. Rooms no one notices." She stopped. I guess I used to believe that if I made things beautiful, they wouldn't leave." The answer landed heavier than either of them expected. Julian's voice lowered. And now Clara turned to him, voice steady. "Now I do it so I don't forget what I'm worth." She left him standing there with that, and he didn't sleep well that night. Not because of the storm, but because he realized for the first time since this all began, he didn't want this to be a game anymore. Clara walked back to her room slowly after her conversation with Julian, her hand brushing the wood-paneled wall as she moved through the dim hallway. The storm outside had softened, though thunder still grumbled in the distance like an old man refusing to sleep. She paused at the door, turned the knob, and stepped into her small corner of the house. She didn't turn on the light. Instead, she sat down at her desk and opened her sketchbook. The page she'd left half-finished earlier now called to her, the kite-shaped moon still hovering in midair above the small figures of a woman and child. She picked up her pencil and added tiny details fingertips, holding string curls in the child's hairlines of wind swirling through the scene. She didn't draw for commissions anymore. She hadn't drawn for anyone in years. But tonight it felt different, like something inside her had been acknowledged, not pitied, not saved. Seen. Julian's question lingered in her mind. Why do you do all this? She hadn't expected to answer, and she definitely hadn't expected to mean it. But the truth sat in her like a quiet stone. She fixed things because no one had fixed her. And if she could just preserve one thing in heirloom, a wall a child's smile, maybe something about her life would still matter. Down the hall, Julian stood at the bar with a tumbler of untouched scotch in his hand. He wasn't used to replaying conversations. Usually people's words slid off him like water meetings, boardroom pitches, social chatter. But Clara's voice, it clung. Now I do it so I don't forget what I'm worth. There had been no self-pity in her tone, no accusation. Just a raw, quiet strength, the kind that made you feel small, but not because she made you feel that way, because you'd never realized how much you'd overlooked. He poured the scotch back into the decanter and walked into the music room. Clara's restored music box sat on the grand piano, the one no one touched. He turned the key she had fabricated. Soft notes drifted out, a lullaby of porcelain and ghosts. He sat at the piano bench, let his fingers hover over the keys. He didn't know how to play. He'd had lessons once in childhood, but nothing had stuck. He hadn't been interested in beauty back then, only in winning. But now, he pressed a single key. It echoed gently, joining the melody of the music box. For the first time in a long while, he wondered what it would mean to build something instead of owning it. The next morning, Clara found a note on her sketchbook. Your art deserves more space than shadows. J tucked beneath it was a small gold key and an address. She blinked, frowned, slipped the key into her pocket. She'd ask about it later. Or maybe she wouldn't, because a seed of something had taken root the night before, and no amount of rain could wash it away now. Julian stared at the envelope in his hands like it might bite him. It sat on the edge of his desk, sealed but unaddressed, inside a letter he'd rewritten 5 times. No legal jargon, no business tone. Just the truth laid bare in ink he nearly couldn't bring himself to use. The bet, the lie, the trap he'd walked into, and the feelings he hadn't expected to find. It wasn't just an explanation. It was a confession. And he knew if Clara read it, she would never see him the same way again. Which was exactly the point. He didn't want to keep pretending. Not anymore. Not after the night with Annabelle. Not after the hallway conversation that had left him hollowed out and filled all at once. She deserved the truth, and he was finally ready to give it. That afternoon, he told his assistant to cancel all meetings. I need the next 2 days, Julian said, tightening the buttons on his navy jacket. Personal leave. His assistant raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Julian tucked the letter into the inside pocket of his coat and drove. Clara wasn't in the West Wing. She wasn't in the greenhouse or the stables or the music room. He finally found her in the sunroom alone, surrounded by sketches, dried herbs, and specks of gold leaf she'd been applying to a worn picture frame. Sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, casting patterns over her hands. She didn't look up when he stepped in. You're home early, she said softly. I needed to see you. She finally looked up. There was a moment, a stillness, and for the first time he looked nervous. I need to tell you something, he said. Something important. I should have told you before we married. Her fingers froze over the gold leaf. But before he could speak again, the phone on the wall rang. Loud, sharp, jarring. Clara jumped. He didn't move. Let it ring. Julian said eyes on her, but she stood brushing flecks of gold from her hands. It might be Eden's doctor. She crossed the room and picked up the receiver. Hello, Julian stood frozen, the weight of the letter burning against his chest. Clara's back tensed. What? She turned slightly. Her voice shifted. Yes, this is her. What happened? Julian stepped forward, but she raised one hand instinctively to keep him back. I understand, she said, swallowing hard. Yes. Thank you for letting me know. She hung up, and for a beat the room felt like it couldn't breathe. Julian moved toward her. Clara, her face had gone pale. That was the manager at Eden's school, she said quietly. My mother collapsed during pickup. Ambulance took them both to County General. Julian didn't hesitate. I'll drive. The car ride was silent, but not empty. Clara sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her hands clutched in her lap. Julian drove with one hand tight around the wheel, the other clenched beside the letter in his coat. He kept glancing at her, not to speak, just to make sure she was still breathing. When they arrived at the hospital, Clara stepped out without a word, already halfway to the front desk before he'd cut the engine. He tucked the letter deeper into his pocket. This was not the moment. Not yet. He stayed in the waiting room while she saw the doctors called Eden's school, spoke to a nurse, then returned with tired eyes and no makeup. She's stable, Clara whispered. Dehydration, stress. They're keeping her overnight. Eden's fine, just scared. Julian nodded. I'll stay, as long as you need. She looked at him, searching his face for something. And maybe for the first time she found it. Not charm, not polish, just presence. That night, Julian placed the envelope on her nightstand while she showered. When she came out, hair damp and eyes red, he was already asleep on the guest couch across from her bed. The envelope sat in silence beside her pillow. She didn't touch it. Not yet. But she didn't throw it away either. The envelope sat there like a weight in the room, heavier than the storm that had passed, heavier than her exhaustion. Clara looked at it as she towel-dried her hair, the scent of antiseptic and soap still clinging to her skin. The steam from her shower had fogged the mirror, and for a moment she could pretend she was someone else, someone without a sick mother in a hospital bed, without a child tucked into a fold-out cot down the hall, without a husband who was only hers on paper. She sat on the edge of the bed, the towel slipping from her shoulders. The envelope had no name, no note. Just a crease down the center, like it had been opened and resealed 100 times before it ever reached her. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked at Julian. He had fallen asleep, fully dressed, one hand resting on his chest, the other dangling limply at his side. The couch barely fit him, and his tie was still half knotted, like he hadn't expected to stay. His brow was slightly furrowed, even in sleep, like something inside him refused to rest. He looked tired. Not the tired of too many meetings or late-night phone calls, but something deeper, worn down in the quiet way people only noticed when they stopped performing. Clara pulled the blanket from the foot of her bed and walked over. She draped it over him gently, careful not to wake him. Then she stood there a moment longer, studying the lines in his face. She thought of the way he had driven her here without a second thought. The way he hadn't spoken, hadn't pressed, hadn't tried to fix anything. Just sat beside her, present. Not a prince, not a savior. Just there. She turned back to the envelope, still unopened. She picked it up, slid her finger beneath the flap, then stopped. Something inside her intuition, fear memory, froze her in place. This moment. It didn't feel like a betrayal waiting to be exposed. It felt like a turning point, waiting to be tested. And she wasn't ready, not yet. At dawn, she woke to the smell of coffee. The hospital had called early, her mother was resting comfortably, and Eden had finally fallen asleep beside her. Clara had cried softly into her pillow after the call ended, more out of release than relief. When she walked into the kitchen, Julian was at the stove in rolled-up sleeves and bare feet, flipping something in a skillet with the kind of cautious optimism of someone who didn't quite belong in domestic life but wanted to try anyway. "I found eggs," he said. Clara blinked. "You cook?" He shrugged. "Not really. But I figured I could try making something that doesn't come with a catering bill." She smiled before she could stop herself. It wasn't big, but it was real. The envelope was still in her nightstand drawer. She'd placed it there the night before, tucked under Eden's drawing. She would open it. But not today. Today she wanted to see what Julian looked like when he burned the toast and tried again anyway. The photo hit the internet at 8:03 a.m. By 8:16, it was on the front page of every tabloid feed in New York. And by 8:30, Clara's phone was vibrating non-stop on the kitchen counter, messages from numbers she didn't recognize, articles forwarded by her old neighbor, a voicemail from her landlord saying, "I had no idea you were married to Julian Cross." She hadn't opened anything yet. She just stood in the kitchen, frozen, still holding the coffee mug Julian had handed her less than 10 minutes earlier. He was upstairs getting dressed for a press meeting he didn't want to attend. He had made her toast again. It was slightly burnt again. She had teased him gently. For a moment they'd felt like two people trying, like something was forming beneath the surface, quiet and real. But now the headlines screamed, "Billion-dollar bet Julian Cross marries nobody for company control wife, was pawn in corporate power play." And she had no idea. Inside the cruel wager that bought Julian his throne, Clara's heart thudded once, twice, and then she clicked the photo. It was a screenshot from a leaked message chain, a group text between Julian's brother Damien and two of his inner circle. The bet spelled out in smug, scathing detail. "Watch him charm the cleaning lady or whoever he finds. Man's willing to marry a broomstick if it gets him my shares. Can he really make her love him, though? Doesn't matter. 1 year. That's all the contract says. We'll destroy him after." And then beneath it a blurry zoom of their courthouse wedding photo. Clara looking small beside him. Julian hadn't said those words, but the silence of his absence from the chat said everything. He knew. She walked to the guest room on autopilot. Her hands didn't shake. Her breath stayed steady, but inside her chest was collapsing. She opened the nightstand drawer, pulled out the envelope, opened it. Julian's handwriting filled the page. "Clara, there's something I have to confess. Something I should have told you the day we met. I didn't come to that shop by accident." She read every word, every sentence about the bet, the manipulation, his brother, his guilt, his shame, and then the shift. "But then I saw you fix things no one else noticed. I saw the way you made space for others without asking for any in return. I didn't plan on falling in love with you, but I did. Love. That word burned. By the time she reached the end, if you never forgive me, I understand. But I will never stop trying to deserve the version of myself I found with you." Her hands had begun to tremble. She folded the letter, slipped it back in the envelope, and walked out the front door. Julian came down minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, adjusting his cufflinks. Clara silence. He checked the kitchen, the sunroom, the workshop. She was gone. Then he saw the envelope, placed on the breakfast table beside the burnt toast and cooling coffee. But something was missing inside, the child's drawing. It was no longer tucked beneath the letter. She had taken it with her. Across the city, Clara boarded the subway with no destination in mind. Her phone buzzed in her bag, but she didn't check it. She clutched the folded crayon drawing in her lap, like a talisman, Eden's bright sun smiling through the creases. She had survived worse. She would survive this. But this time she wasn't leaving because she was broken. She was leaving because she refused to be. The train car was nearly empty. Clara sat by the window, her reflection flickering across the darkened glass as the subway rattled through the city. She hadn't said a word since she left the house. She didn't know where she was going, not really. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. The envelope sat in her lap, its seal broken, the truth still echoing between the folds of paper. She ran her fingers along the edge absent-mindedly. Julian's words were still in her ears. "I didn't plan on falling in love with you, but I did. That was the line that hurt the most. Not because it wasn't true, but because a part of her, stubborn and tired and still a little in love, wanted to believe it. She got off at the Lexington stop not because it meant anything but because her hands needed something to do. The sidewalk was slick with rain, the gutters glittering with broken light. She walked 3 blocks before she realized she was standing in front of the Sunrise Community Center. She hadn't been here in 2 years. Back when Eden used to color on the tile floor while Clara led art classes for kids who had nowhere else to go. Before rent hikes and medical bills and exhaustion had forced her to give it up. The building looked tired now. The paint was peeling. One of the window shutters was cracked. But it still stood. It still waited. She exhaled and stepped inside. Julian, meanwhile, had never known silence like this. The mansion, so vast and empty before Clara, now felt cavernous, unbearable. The housekeeper passed him in the hallway and paused. "Sir, is she gone?" Julian only nodded. She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was a knot. Upstairs in the sunroom, Clara's tea mug still sat on the table, half full. Her scarf was draped over the back of the chair. Her sketchbook lay open on the armrest, a penciled drawing of Annabelle flying a moon-shaped kite clutched in one tiny fist. He picked it up and stared. It felt like looking into someone else's dream, and he had ruined it. By evening, the media storm had reached full roar. News vans parked outside the Cross headquarters. Paparazzi stalked the gates of the estate. Editorials dissected his motives, his character, his coldness. But none of it mattered. Julian wasn't reading any of it. He was standing in the hallway outside Clara's room, one hand resting on the doorframe. He hadn't gone in. Not once. Even now, with her gone, something in him refused to cross that threshold. She had lived in this house quietly like a ghost, but her absence roared through it now like fire, and he had no idea how to put it out. Back at the community center, Clara helped an old volunteer stack chairs in the main room. No one recognized her at first, not in her plain clothes and weary eyes. But after a moment, one of the teenage girls gasped, "Miss Clara?" Clara smiled, small, tired, but real. "I'm just here to help." She didn't say anything else. Not yet, but she would. Eventually. Because if the world could fall apart in a headline, maybe it could be rebuilt in quiet rooms like this one. Julian Cross was used to pressure. He'd held billion-dollar mergers together with a handshake and a deadline. He'd silenced scandals with a look, reshaped boardrooms with a sentence. But nothing, not a fiscal collapse, not a courtroom battle, not even his father's funeral felt like this. This was worse. This was personal. Clara was gone. And for the first time in his life, no amount of money, charm, or strategic planning could bring her back. Damien was everywhere. His brother's smug face grinned from the covers of business magazines and viral videos. It was just a game, Damien had said to a camera outside his office. Julian never loved her. He just wanted my shares. I gave him a challenge, and look what he did. The world ate it up. The headlines turned savage Julian Cross manipulator in a suit. The woman he married and humiliated, where is Clara? Now, romance or ruthlessness. The Cross brothers and their Cold War of the heart. Julian's board demanded answers. His PR team begged him to speak out, to deny it all, to save the brand. He said nothing. Because what was left to say? It was true. Maybe not all of it, maybe not the way Damien spun it, but the bones of the story were real. The bet, the silence, the deception, and the woman he'd used, then fallen in love with too late. He withdrew from the public eye completely. No more meetings, no appearances, no deals. He stepped down from the Cross and Wolf executive board 2 weeks after the scandal broke. The press called it cowardice. He called it consequence. His assistant pleaded with him, "You're letting Damien win." "No," Julian said, his voice rough, quiet. "I'm letting Clara go." He didn't retreat to a penthouse or a private island. He went to Brooklyn, to the Sunrise Community Center where Clara had once taught art to kids from shelters and broken homes. He remembered the name from her resume long before the wedding, a footnote at the time. Now it was a lifeline. He showed up the first day with nothing but a tool belt and a simple offer, "I'm here to fix whatever's broken." The volunteers didn't recognize him. He didn't expect them to. He swept floors. He repaired cracked windows. He painted over graffiti unasked. When the roof leaked, he patched it himself. When a shipment of supplies arrived late, he waited out in the cold until they came. He didn't speak about Clara, not once. But every corner he repaired, every hinge he tightened, every frame he built, it all whispered her name. 3 weeks in, one of the teen boys handed him a sheet of paper. A sketch, penciled delicate, a side profile of a woman sitting on the floor, hands covered in paint, a child leaning against her. Julian blinked. "Who drew this?" The boy shrugged. "She did. Miss Clara. Left it in the supply cabinet last year." Julian held it carefully like it might tear under his fingers. He didn't cry, but his throat burned. That night he pulled the last of his inheritance files from his personal safe, the trust his father had left, the controlling stake in the company, the keys to an empire he no longer wanted. He drafted a statement by hand, effective immediately. I, Julian Cross, renounce all shares, assets, and voting control granted through the Cross and Wolf succession terms. All holdings will revert to the board and controlling family members excluding Damian Cross. My decision is final and irrevocable. Julian Marcus Cross. His lawyer balked. "This is everything. You're walking away from billions." Julian didn't even look up. "She's worth more." Across the city, Clara watched from the community center break room as the news broke. Julian Cross resigns, donates all Cross and Wolf holdings, cities, personal accountability. Insider, he gave up everything. Didn't even blink. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the cup of tea. The kids were laughing in the next room. She closed her eyes. The world hadn't stopped, but something inside it had shifted. Julian didn't tell anyone what he was doing with his days. He woke early, dressed in old jeans and a black thermal shirt, and took the train to the community center like any other volunteer. He showed up before the doors opened, left after they locked, and asked for nothing in return. He rebuilt storage cabinets, sanded down warped floorboards, even fixed a rusted swing set behind the building that no one had touched in years. Slowly, quietly, the center began to change. Not because of grand gestures, but because of care, effort, consistency. The kind of things he'd once believed were beneath him. Now they were all that made sense. On one particularly rainy Thursday, Julian spent the afternoon repairing a mosaic wall that had fallen into disrepair. Clara had once helped design it. He could tell by the soft curves and small etched initials at the corner CV. He worked in silence, fitting broken tiles back into place. A small hand tapped his shoulder. It was a little boy with curly hair and paint on his fingers. "Miss Clara used to fix that one," he said, pointing at a pale green tile. "She said it was her favorite color, like her mom's garden." Julian smiled faintly. "She has good taste." The boy squinted at him. "You look sad." "I am?" Julian admitted. "Did you do something bad?" Julian paused. "Yes, I hurt someone important." The boy thought for a second, then said, "When I hurt people, Miss Clara says you gotta fix more than what broke. You gotta be better than before." Julian's voice caught. "She said that?" "Yep." "But also not to touch her toolbox." Julian laughed soft and hoarse. The boy scampered off. Julian turned back to the mosaic, the green tile still warm in his palm. He pressed it in. Not perfectly, but firmly. That evening he stood in the rain outside a thrift bookstore 2 blocks from the center. Clara used to mention it once or twice in passing, with a softness in her voice. Something about the quiet, about the smell of old pages, about how Eden liked the children's corner with the mismatched beanbags. He walked inside, rain dripping from his shoulders. The bell above the door chimed. The woman behind the counter didn't recognize him, but she nodded politely as he browsed the shelves. In the back, he found a gently used leather-bound book on antique furniture restoration, dated thorough, hand-noted in the margins. Inside the front cover, a faint signature in pencil C. Voss. He ran his fingers over the faded letters. He bought the book without a word, and walked home with it under his arm, shielding it from the rain. That night he placed it on his nightstand. He didn't need to read it. He just needed to remember what it felt like to hold something she once believed in. In her apartment across the city, Clara sat on the floor of her living room beside Eden, who was drawing moons and flowers with fierce concentration. The TV played in the background, but Clara wasn't watching. She stared at her phone instead. Julian's resignation had gone viral, not in a flashy way, but in a quiet, unbelievable one. He had walked away from everything, and for once not for strategy, not for power, just for the truth. It was the sound of the bell above the antique shop door that made Clara look up. She hadn't heard that chime in nearly a year, not since the day Julian Cross had walked in and changed the course of her life with a lie dressed like an offer. She expected a customer, or maybe one of the neighborhood kids coming to see if she had any new scraps they could turn into a treasure. But when the door closed, she saw him, standing in the same coat, though a little more worn. No assistant, no driver, no watch on his wrist, no tie, just Julian. She said nothing. Neither did he. Until he reached into his coat and carefully removed something wrapped in brown paper and twine. It was small, fragile. He set it gently on the counter between them. "I believe this used to belong to you," he said. Clara didn't move. He untied the twine and peeled back the paper. Inside was the music box, the one she had restored years ago and sold during a winter so lean she'd skipped meals to buy Eden's medication. She hadn't seen it since. And yet, there it was. The tiny ballerina still balanced mid-pirouette, the silver now slightly dulled by time, but it was hers. She looked at it then back at him. "How did you find it? I've been looking," he said simply. "Pawn shop in Queens. It took months." Still, she said nothing. Julian's voice softened. "I didn't come to ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not a second chance. I just wanted you to know. I meant it. Everything in that letter. I left the company. I walked away from the money. From the game. Damien won." Clara crossed her arms. "And what did that prove? That I'm not who I was when I met you?" He paused. "But I also know that doesn't matter unless I show you." He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a folded flyer. "Community event. Children's art show. The Sunrise Center. I volunteer now," he added. "Maintenance. Setup. Occasionally I fix a door or two." She glanced at the flyer. "I don't expect anything," he said. "But if you ever wanted to visit, even just to see how far the new roof goes before it leaks." That earned the smallest, briefest flicker of a smile from her. It vanished quickly. Julian exhaled, then stepped back. "I'll go," he said. "I just needed to return that to you." He turned toward the door, but her voice stopped him. "You kept the letter." He looked back. "I did." "Why?" "Because it reminds me of the line between who I was and who I'm still becoming." Another pause. She reached out and gently touched the music box, then looked at him. Really looked. "You look tired," she said quietly. "I am. But less hollow." Julian almost smiled. She didn't ask him to stay, but she didn't ask him to leave either. Instead, she whispered, "The ballerina never spun right." He stepped forward, careful, reverent, turned the key once. The music began to play. The ballerina twirled slowly, still, imperfect, but moving. "Maybe she just needed time," he said. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the world had broken, neither of them looked away. The melody spun gently between them. Clara kept her hands lightly on the counter fingertips, brushing the edge of the music box. The sound wasn't flawless. There was a slight catch in the mechanism, a stutter between notes, but somehow it felt truer that way. Real things didn't play perfectly. They carried the memory of being broken. Julian stood across from her, not moving, not pressing. He watched her not with expectation, but with the kind of quiet reverence that only comes from knowing you've been given more time than you deserve. Clara finally spoke again. "I thought I'd never see this again. I wasn't sure I'd find it," he said. "I almost gave up. Then I saw the initials scratched underneath the velvet lining. E.V. Eden Voss," she murmured. "She wanted to sign it like artists do, said she was my partner." Julian smiled, something soft lighting his face. She was right. Clara looked down, tracing the music box's edge. "It got us through a rough winter. The rent was overdue. My mother was in and out of the hospital. Eden had a fever I couldn't break. That ballerina fed us for 2 weeks. He didn't interrupt. He let her speak something he hadn't always done. I don't regret letting it go, she continued, but I never thought anyone would care enough to bring it back. Julian's voice was steady. I've been learning how to care, not just feel it, show it, with my hands, my time, my choices. She looked at him again. Really looked. His eyes were the same stormy gray as always, but something inside them had settled. Less fire, more flame. Controlled. Earned. What do you want from me, she asked, not accusing, just honest. Nothing, he said. Not unless you offer it freely. A pause. I made a mess, Julian added. Not just with you, but with my life. I built a kingdom on silence and numbers and cold transactions. Then I met you, and for the first time I wanted something that couldn't be bought. Clara's chest tightened. She gripped the counter to steady herself. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square envelope, but this time it wasn't a letter. It was a photograph. Clara's breath caught. The image showed the front of a small building, an old shop front, slightly run down but sunlit and full of potential. The sign above the door had been restored with delicate gold paint. It read, Voss and Cross Restoration Studio. I bought it last month, he said. No press, no grand opening. Just a space. For you, for your work, for whatever you choose to make of it. Clara stared at the photo, her throat tight. You gave up your entire company. I did. For this, for you. A long silence fell. Then Clara folded the photo, gently pressed it to her chest, and whispered, You can't buy your way back into someone's life. I know, Julian said. That's why I built the door and left it open. Spring arrived quietly that year. The city thawed beneath soft winds and slow mornings, the kind that carried the scent of rain-soaked pavement and blooming magnolias. On the edge of a cobblestone block in the East Village, a freshly painted sign swung above a modest storefront, Voss and Cross Restoration Studio, fine antique work, memory kept alive. There were no ads, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a quiet opening day and a hand-lettered note on the door. Walk-ins welcome, no past required. Inside, Clara dusted the windowsills one last time before flipping the open sign. Sunlight bathed the wood floors. Framed sketches lined one wall, her designs old and new. A child's drawing was framed behind the counter. Red crayon. Stick figures holding hands. A sun with bright rays, the words, One day Mom will be happy again. It no longer felt like a wish. It felt like a memory. At noon, the bell over the door jingled softly. Julian stepped in, not in a suit this time, but in rolled sleeves and jean sleeves flecked with old varnish from a cabinet he'd helped restore the day before. He didn't say anything right away. He walked to the counter, hands in his pockets, and looked around the space with quiet admiration. You built it exactly like you sketched it, he said. No, Clara replied, her voice calm. We built it. You gave it breath, but I gave it life. Julian's smile was faint but full. I can live with that. They stood in that golden light for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket, not for a ring, not this time, but for something small wrapped in velvet. He placed it on the counter. She opened it carefully. Inside was a key, but not to the shop. It was old brass ornate, a skeleton key once used for the front door of her childhood home. She had told him about it once offhandedly in the early days when she'd thought he wasn't listening. She stared at it, blinking. How did you find this? A collector had it, he said softly, traced it by the serial number stamped beneath the base. Took me a while. Clara picked it up, turned it over in her hand. I didn't come here to propose, Julian added. Not formally, not with fanfare or expectations. She looked up at him. I came to ask, he continued, if I could stand beside you, in your world, not as a husband by contract, but as a man who finally understands what it means to stay. Clara took a long breath. Then she walked around the counter and stood in front of him. And in that moment, without music or rings or witnesses, she reached up, brushed a curl from his forehead, and whispered, Yes. Julian exhaled like he'd been holding his breath since the day they met. Clara leaned in and rested her forehead against his. No kiss. Not yet. Just the closeness of two people who had walked through fire and rain and their own worst mistakes and survived. Outside the street bustled with the quiet joy of a spring afternoon. Inside the music box spun gently on a shelf. Imperfect, but still playing. The end. Sometimes love doesn't begin with roses or vows. It begins with a lie, a letter never sent, and the quiet courage to change. This was a story about redemption, about healing the broken, and about choosing love, not because it's easy, but because it's real. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. And if stories of transformation, second chances, and love that grows from the cracks speak to you, don't forget to subscribe and click on the screen for more tales just like this one. Thanks for being here. See you in the next story.